Okay, I think we are live. Louise, are you with me?
I'm here. It says live in the bottom
Fantastic.
left-hand corner, so I think we're good.
Great, we're going to trust the technology. All right, so everybody, thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time out of your evening to meet and watch Louise as she talks about this incredible book that we've selected for this event. It's called Stolen Lives. I've been reading it for the past week, and I just have to say it's been a journey to read it. And I've really appreciated it as someone who takes an active interest in what is going on in this country in terms of trafficking and modern slavery and human rights. It's a really invaluable piece of work. And I'd like to just invite you, Louise, to this event, one of our first digital events at Lighthouse.
Oh, really? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You are pride of place. So this is one of our first, and for anyone who doesn't know or who is new to this, Louise is an incredible journalist who has worked in has written for several publications, and has written this book kind of over several years. It's an incredibly in-depth piece of investigative work that takes on a lot of the really huge questions, and I think is a testament to your writing ability, actually, and your investigative ability to have followed it through to its end. So thank you so much for writing this, and we'll get on with this interview.
Oh, that's lovely. Thanks so much.
No worries. Thank you for joining us. Just as a quick note to the audience, we are going to speak for roughly 30 minutes between me and Louise, but at the end, we would love it if you could submit some questions. We'll have about 15 minutes towards the end for audience questions. So type them in the chat. Mari will be reading them. They won't get lost. We'll choose some of the best ones. And you can also upvote them. So if someone has written a question that you really want to be answered, give them a little nudge to the top. Okay. So let's begin. Louise, what prompted you to write this book?
Oh, people keep asking me this. I think you'd think I would have had a smoother answer ready by now, but essentially, it's been something that I've been so passionate about for about 10 years. And it's one of those things where, as a self-employed journalist, as a freelancer, you're often sort of pitching ideas, pitching radio documentaries, pitching TV documentaries. So I was always kind of making sure that my knowledge was up to date, that it was a story that I was always following. And then it dawned on me that no matter what combination of media that I tried to come up with, whether it was a TV series or a documentary or a podcast, I just couldn't get the format right to really tell the story. A book didn't dawn on me until I was chatting to someone where I said, I really just want to do a really simple book where I'm sort of telling the stories of survivors and giving them their voice back. And it was something that I was going to do in my spare time and maybe pop it on the internet like the young people do, ebooks, that sort of thing. I didn't really know anything about publishing. And this friend said, I think you're selling it a bit short. I think this could be really something. And she put me in touch with her literary agent, who on the spot said, we need to make this book happen. And that she introduced me to the amazing people at Sandstone, and I cannot speak highly enough of them as publishers. They're just fantastic, good people. And that was it. Yeah, they said, we think it's imperative that you write this book, and that was it. It was a lot easier than anything in TV, that's definitely for sure. So yeah, I think fate all sort of came together at the same time.
Fantastic. Oh, I'm glad to hear it. And it's always so good when someone has like really positive things to say about the publishing process, especially when they come from a different field. And
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I knew nothing about it, and I think I've been like an overeager student to Moira, my editor, saying, "What happens now? What happens now? Then what happens?" And she's been so patient with me.
Fantastic. So for anyone, I realized that I didn't give an overview of what the book is actually about. I'll try and speak a little slower because maybe that will help the sound. And Louise, maybe we can see if we can both do that. Maybe that will help.
Yeah, sure. I've turned my volume up.
Fab. So just as a quick overview for anyone who is thinking about the book who isn't so sure of what it's about, this is an investigation into modern slavery in the UK. And thank you, everyone. Into modern slavery in the UK and human trafficking. And I think that it has been very eye-opening to see that actually this is a huge, huge problem. And whilst previously we may have thought that this is something that happens in other places, or something that is quite low down in the level of priorities or things like that, what this book does is show us through not only interviews with government officials, with the police, with charities like Salvation Army, but also through survivors and some incredible, incredible accounts, just shows how prevalent this problem actually is. And I think kind of going on from that, it might be worth it if we just establish some definitions to start with. So, Louise, could you take us through some definitions of modern slavery, human trafficking, and then what the difference is between human trafficking and human smuggling?
So I'm going to start with the difference between people smuggling and human trafficking, because I find that the easiest one to explain. Basically, if you're going to sort of look at the law, then human trafficking is a crime against the person, and people smuggling is a crime against the state. Essentially, though, in terms of human terms, the difference is the element of compliance and consent. Now, that's gets a bit more complicated, as I'll explain, but it's essentially, if I wanted to get from A to B and I needed your help, I would, if this was a case of people smuggling, we'd agree a price, you would take me, and at the end of the journey we'd part ways. I'd have my freedom, I'd pay you the money, and off we'd go. That transaction would end. With people trafficking, that we might think that that's how the journey is going to start. I might think, and this is often where the confusion lies, I might think that you're about to smuggle me to get me where I want to go, but at the end of that transaction, actually my papers are taken from me and I'm trapped under your control. So that's the sort of the bridging point where trafficking and smuggling get confused, because often we talk about smuggling in terms of the migrant crisis, and that's when people sort of interchange smuggling and trafficking, but trafficking happens in a much more wider area than purely when we look at the migrant crisis. So trafficking is basically getting people from A to B through deception, through coercion, through fear. So, for example, I might willingly go to Paris because someone's offered me an amazing job in Paris, so I'm willingly going there. However, when I get there, I find out that the job is fake. And actually, I think I'm going to start working in a hotel as a chambermaid or a receptionist, but actually I'm in a brothel. So even though I willingly go on that journey from A to B, I was taken there through deception. Or maybe I go from A to B through fear because someone says we'll kill your family if you don't do it. So trafficking is basically making someone move or transporting them with the element of fear and control over them, so they have no choice or they're being deceived. And modern slavery is then the end point of that, which is basically when you have your freedoms taken away from you. You are in some form of enforced labour, enforced criminality, sexual exploitation, any kind of exploitation where you cannot leave, whether it's because you're physically restrained, which is more rare, but usually it's because you are emotionally controlled, and the practicalities of, your papers have been taken, you're in a different country, you don't know the language. All these things can mean that someone actually has their freedom taken away and they can't escape. You scared me. Sorry. Then. Has the volume gone? It's all right, no.
No, it's just me. I thought it'd be good to unmute my mic, but there's a next step to that. So just going off what you were saying in the definitions, there's just so much to take in, and a way that you refer to modern slavery particularly is kind of a crime that's in plain sight. Of this kind of being something that people can see, and the enormity of that is quite staggering. And there was someone who you interviewed who talked about how, like, the political will, or even just the kind of the will of people to kind of see how far it reaches, in that when we find that some of our meat is tainted or it's unhealthy, we'll actually go through, we'll find every single thing that meat or that bacteria or that illness has touched, and we will make sure that it doesn't come into our food system anymore. And people really get on board with that. But just the vastness of trafficking and modern slavery across the world and how very interconnected that is means that actually we aren't necessarily doing the same thing. We don't seem to have the same drive, even if we're perhaps becoming more aware of those things. And I think it's quite staggering to see the numbers, because this is something that you do quite well in this book, is show the numbers. So you have the national referral system. Can you explain just very quickly what that is?
Yeah, the amount of times I wrote and rewrote the explanation about the national referral mechanism, because it sounds so technical, but essentially it is the framework that we have in the UK. It's also used elsewhere in the world, but it's the framework in the UK where if someone is identified as being a victim of trafficking and they are placed into this system. So within the national referral mechanism, it's how the government identifies how many people have been rescued and have gone in, because that is different sometimes for reasons I'm sure we'll go into later. People are rescued and don't want to enter this system. So it's how you kind of monitor the people that are rescued, and it's also how they access the support once they have chosen to go through the support system.
Right. So I think in 2018, there's 7,000 people who were referred in the UK to this mechanism.
Yeah, and that's who was referred in.
Yes. And then perhaps going, like, kind of referring back to what you were saying, the Global Slavery Index, I think now and previously even in 2016 was saying actually there's probably something like 136,000 people in the UK at any one time under conditions of slavery.
Yeah.
Can you help us
So firstly, the numbers are, when it comes to statistics, because of the kind of dark, hidden, secretive crime that it is, and the way that the traffickers and the slave gangs control their victims. Firstly, many victims don't acknowledge that they're victims. They don't see that they're victims. They think that this is their life, especially because traffickers are very clever at targeting people who have already been targeted. So they're really good at targeting vulnerable people. So, for example, if someone has been brought over here, trafficked here to work in domestic servitude, there's a pretty good chance they could have been targeted from a similar situation in a different country from a young age. So firstly, victims don't always identify themselves or see themselves as victims. Secondly, they're just too scared to come forward. So what you see when people are rescued and then they agree to go into the system is the tip of the iceberg, because these are the people that say, actually, yes, please help me, I'm in the system now. So there's all sorts of different issues around identification and monitoring. There was a new survey that came out earlier on this year, actually, after we'd gone to print, and it was a study from the Centre for Social Justice and a charity called Hope and Justice, and Justice and Care, sorry, and they've done their study, which they estimate is 100,000. So either way, there is a huge difference between 7,000 being entered in 1 year and the suspected 136,000.
Yeah, and this is kind of the enormity of, I guess, the issue and the problem, but also the lives. And I think that the title Stolen Lives just really does hit home that these are people who should be having these different lives, should be kind of as horrified, should not be living through this. This should be a story that is far gone in our history. And yet it's real. And they're, I guess, kind of speaking to what you were saying about people not necessarily seeing themselves as victims, was one thing that really helped me to understand that was the story of Jay. So you talk to Jay and her story is harrowing. It's absolutely terrifying.
It's horrific. It's horrific.
Yeah, and I guess maybe could you just briefly just explain what Jay went through and where she kind of fits into this book?
Sure. So what I did with the survivor stories was kind of wove them in between the kind of investigative book, because I wanted them to have chapters which was going back to the original idea of them having a voice. So as much as possible, I let them speak. And Jay's is a standalone chapter, and her story is that and I have to be so careful when I'm sort of talking about survivors, because obviously you don't want to ever give anything that identifies them. So I actually don't know Jay's real name, or where she is or anything about her. I know that she was in the north of England as a teenager, and a neighbour kind of took her under his wing. I think she had quite a vulnerable childhood. She came from quite maybe potentially, let's say, chaotic lifestyle, certainly unconventional lifestyle. And he took her under his wing and gave her presents, etc. The typical story that we now hear about grooming. That then developed into him passing her around gangs of men, and she was taken for days and passed around gangs of men. I actually I don't think it's appropriate to even start talking about what was done to her, for people who don't want to hear it. And if you get to the chapter in the book, you'll understand why. But she has physical problems to this day that stop her from living let's say, normal life. She has certain constraints because of the physical impact of what's been done to her, and of course the emotional impact too. I'll get back to the end of her story, but she's the perfect example of someone who doesn't understand what trafficking is, because as far as she's concerned, that was her life. She was abused. She was passed from man to man, from gang to gang. Interactions with the police weren't always very helpful for her. She ended up in hospital several times. The gangs would always find out when she'd been taken home by the police, when she'd been in hospital. They gave her the implication that if she cooperated with the police, she would come to harm. I don't think her family really knew what to do, and she was in and out of. She was one of those women that fell through the cracks because of her age. Domestic violence shelter said, well, you're not being beaten up by a partner or a parent, so you can't come here. She fell through so many cracks. And as she said herself, she wasn't a great victim, a witness rather, because her life was chaotic. She was distressed. Many, many victims of trafficking and slavery find it a struggle to talk about their experiences, to comprehend their experiences, and also the level of PTSD that so many of them have means that it's incredibly difficult for them to even recall events because they've shut down. So from a police prosecution point of view, Jay did accept that it would be very difficult for the police to help her. But it was when she was taken into the care of the Salvation Army that they said, what's happened to you is trafficking, and almost giving it a title and having a name and knowing that it fell under some kind of umbrella term. She said, they got it, they got me, they got it. And that was when her journey began. And obviously she has many things that she has to deal with, but she's studying now for a career which will see her helping other people. And honestly, what happened to her takes my breath away, and in a very bad way. But yet the spirit that she's shown to put her life back together and build a new life and find something good to cling on to and build on, it's such a testament to the human spirit. And just so you know, the people who did this to her are still at large. There was never a prosecution. So she's in a different part of the country now. She's safe. She's building a new life. But those men are still very much at large.
Thank you. Yeah, like her story is a terribly difficult thing to read, and yet, as you say, like just kind of epitomizes exactly why these things are important, why these acts and why it's important to know what can happen and what someone might go through. And there's this, you do talk about, like, as you said, like this idea of like being a good victim. About having to prove yourself. And there's, if you don't mind, there's just like a little passage relating to this idea of victimhood and who it kind of comes under. I actually wrote the page number down, it's 115. Because it made such an impression on me to read it. So you wrote, unlike any other victim of a crime where the police investigate and refer victims to associated support, and where appropriate, Survivors of trafficking and slavery are dealt with through the Home Office. A police investigation may run alongside this, but the need for a government department to officially declare someone a victim is a process unique to the crime of modern slavery. And it really hit home at that point, like reading Jay's story, reading that despite all of the kind of bounds forward, like the Modern Slavery Act is such a huge step forward, and so is, and it's kind of put the UK kind of at the forefront of tackling trafficking and modern slavery. It really did show that there are some gaps. There are some really, really huge gaps. And Elena, you're the other person who you interviewed and whose story just so incredibly weaves through this book. Her story kind of, I think, epitomized that idea of being so dependent on someone saying, you are a victim and we will believe you. So thinking about Elena was from, I think, Albania.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and she kind of came over, she was deceived as she was kind of forced into a terrible situation of sexual abuse. She managed to find her way free. She was also pregnant and had to kind of face that alone. And towards the end of that, and I guess you kind of had to go on this journey together a little bit to make sure that she was believed. Because it was.
Yeah. I'd interviewed her when she was in the very early processes of being in the system in the NRM. So she'd been rescued. She was getting the help that she needed. She'd had her baby, and we got to I think she'd been waiting 18 months, 2 years for a decision from the Home Office. So initially there's a very kind of basic decision that the first responders will give, and they'll say, you know what, we think that there's reasonable grounds to say that this person is a victim of trafficking. And then they have to wait and wait and wait and wait and wait for a response from the Home Office, which then dictates the rest of the care that they get, and obviously their asylum situation, if that's relevant. And with Elena, I'd met her when she'd had her reasonable grounds decision. So the charities were saying, yep, she's a victim of trafficking. And she was getting the care that she needed, but living under this limbo. She's living in this limbo of waiting for a decision. And that is what people find so hard, because when victims of trafficking, when they go from victims to survivors, they're working on themselves, they have psychologists, doctors, medical care, support systems, all these things in place, but they are living under a massive question mark of what will their future be, because they don't know. And I'd met Elena when she'd been waiting for such a long time, and I said to the charity, look, let me know how she gets on, because it's an awful story what happened to her. And they got in touch with me a couple of about 18 months later, and said, yeah, she got a negative final decision, which essentially means that her story wasn't believed. And I knew, I'd incredibly warmed to this girl, and she had a child, and I just found it awful on a human level. So I sort of wanted to help her, and through contacts that I had, got her in front of the right lawyers, and they did fantastic things. They realised all the mistakes in the early days with previous lawyers, translation errors, questions that I think I sort of mentioned earlier on, when victims of trafficking are being interviewed by the police or by the Home Office. They don't necessarily know what was important, because in Elena's case, she'd gone on holiday with her boyfriend. She didn't know she was then going to end up in a brothel, which is what happened to her. So when the Home Office were asking her really simple questions, what you and I would say really simple questions, like which airport did you go to, what hotel, if you're planning that trip, you would know. But if you're trusting a boyfriend or a fiance, you don't know that you need to remember this 2 years down the line because of what's happened to you. So that's one of the other issues I sort of mentioned earlier about when survivors are being going through the process of having their claims looked at. So there's so much has happened to them that they're not in necessarily great mental state, and they won't necessarily have remembered all the key things that you would think they would have done, because they didn't know they had to remember them, because they didn't know what was going to happen to them.
it's hard not to just kind of let that sink in for a bit, actually. Just the weight of expectation to prove yourself,
Yeah.
kind of over and over again after everything that's happened. So this was a book that took years to write, like the investigative time, the kind of care and attention, the journeys that you saw. I think it took a few years, right?
So the investigation into the issue I've been doing for years. The actual book itself, I think I wrote. Let me see. I think I started it in maybe May, and it was handed in October. So it was years and years of understanding the topics. Elena's story I'd been following for years without knowing that it was ever going to be a book, which was why when I was looking back at my notebooks, I was just thinking, I wish I'd known then that I was going to be telling this story, because so many of my notes were just scribbled and old. And but yeah, it's a topic that I'd been investigating for a long time. And then the book itself, I think I wrote from kind of like April to October.
I suppose something that I'm interested in. Well, I have, I think, two last questions, and then just for our audience, please keep sending your questions, and then after these two, I will read a couple out. So my first one is, you became very aware of the system that people had to go through, and also the way that people fall through the cracks. And
Yeah.
yet consistently throughout this, you're interviewing people who are a part of that system and who are working to their utmost ability, but also sometimes don't seem to know, or the emails that you got back from the Home Office, for example, were frustrating to say the least. So my first question is, what was it like to have to engage with that, especially seeing the stories of people like Elena, and what kind of motivated you to keep going there? But also my second question is, who bridges the gap? Like, what are there any charities, or are there any people who you met who you thought, if you guys, you understand, I trust you to do a good job? Because I think that sometimes we do rely on our charities, don't we?
I think that's the thing. So starting on a positive, and I think you have to be really black and white about everything. So with the police, I met some brilliant coppers, and you just know that this is under their skin. They might switch off their shift at the end of the night, but they will still be thinking about whether they should pop to M&S and buy some pajamas for a safe house. They'll be thinking, should I have a meeting with so and so about how best we can do this? And at the same time, there are also many complaints about police forces to do with modern slavery, because they don't know how to identify it. They don't necessarily interview victims in the most appropriate manner. So there's work to be done there. But again, I didn't witness that. This is what I've heard when I've been interviewing people about their experiences. So, for example, with Jay, the police obviously that she dealt with, she said a couple were good. The rest left a lot to be desired. I met some great coppers. I'm sure it's not consistent charities, and I'm saying this now under the world has changed so much since I handed in the final draft because of COVID and the lockdown and the pandemic globally. So charities are always understretched. They absolutely, from what I've seen, have been all doing their best. There's some great ones that were included. There's some great ones that weren't included. Whether it's charities who are sort of subcontracted by the Salvation Army, because I don't know about you, I think the Salvation Army, I think of brass bands outside John Lewis at Christmas, but they have a government contract to be the first port of call when caring for survivors. So there are charities who are smaller than them that they subcontract out to. You see them doing great work in difficult situations, all of them doing their best. From a government point of view, yes, the legislation is world leading. That doesn't necessarily mean it's as good as it could be. It's world leading, but with gaps and question marks. I know several other countries. Australia has sort of taken from our lead. The main thing that kept coming back from everyone that I spoke to was, yes, we've done great things in terms of the Modern Slavery Act. The bit about the care for victims, there's a whole section in there in how care for victims should be put front and centre, and that was kind of it. It was sort of almost like fill in later, that I believe is sort of semi-finished now. There was complaints about how rigorously people who don't do their modern slavery reporting are punished, if at all. But yeah, so this is basically, on the one hand, it's like people are saying, yeah, Theresa May did genuinely believe in the fight against modern slavery. We started off with a solid piece of legislation, which was wanting. But when I spoke to people who were part of that legislation, they say it's politics. Everyone has an agenda, and you kind of have to meet in the middle a little bit. And there were some things. They're also up against the fact it was a fixed term parliament, so there was a level of speed that was needed. But the one thing that everyone kept coming back to was the disconnect between the government's policy on wanting to be world leaders in fighting modern slavery and the fact that the people that were looking after victims or charged with sort of next steps for victims was the Home Office, which of course has the obligation to keep immigration figures low. So there was always that sort of disconnect that everyone that I interviewed was concerned about. By the end of the sort of, when I was coming to finishing the book, there'd been a big review of the Modern Slavery Act, and Frank Field, then MP, suggested that actually, as a result of this, what should happen, it should be the Cabinet Office. So actually taking away those really emotional decisions from the Home Office, putting it in the Cabinet Office could be a step towards that. But it's been, through the whole writing of the book, the whole system was in a complete state of flux. So there were so many rewrites because some new policy had come in. There'd been a court case where victims had won and the government had to do X, where it got really, really complex, considering I'm not a frontline worker and I don't write policy and I don't work with victims. But from what I could see, there's a lot of really good people doing a lot of really good work. But I think they all just would cry out for a bit more joined up thinking, really. I think that's what it came down to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to take a look at these questions.
That's gone so fast.
Yeah, half an hour is not long.
Really not, no.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone for joining, by the way, if it's all right for me to say that. Obviously, it's really nerve-wracking putting a book out into the world at the best of times, then when there have been so many books released at the same time as mine, and at a time when people maybe want some light-hearted reading as opposed to an investigation into human trafficking. So anyone who's read the book or bought the book or is here, thank you so much for your support. Thank you.
So one of our most upvoted question is, how do we make things better in the future? Oh, sorry. Is it? Yes. Yep.
That's the one.
And it's from Anne. Yeah. How do we make things better in the future?
Hi, Anne. It's a massive question, and I think the answer is it's a holistic answer. It's everyone working together, and I asked this to quite a lot of people about the role that the normal person can play, because obviously there's charities, there's the government, there's policing, all these sort of important people in suits that do their bit. But in terms of what we can do, firstly, it's learning to spot the signs. It's as simple as that, so that when we are making a decision about getting our nails done for £14, when we're thinking about getting a car wash for £6, etc., it's just taking a minute to go, hang on, let's look at the maths of that. Does that kind of add up? Looking at the working conditions that people are in when they're when you're watching them. So for example, if you're thinking, oh, I'll just get an £8 car wash, and it's freezing cold and everyone's in t-shirts and they don't have the protective equipment on, and there's 9 people washing one car, and just to stress, I am not saying that every nail bar that is cash or every cheap car wash, I'm not saying that they're all dodgy. What I'm saying is be aware of what the signs are so that you can make an informed decision. I remember sort of looking at licensing and wondering, make it easy for the consumer, license car washes, license nail bars. I think that would be, I mean, there were people that gave quite articulate answers as to why that won't help, but I'm, from the point of view as us as the consumer, I would feel a lot happier if there was a stamp in the window of somewhere knowing that we were going to an ethical place. So it's knowing the signs of slavery, which are usually they're all on so many charities' websites, but essentially it's when people are cowed, when they don't want to talk to you, if you feel there's a sort of a feeling of oppression. Sometimes it is a gut feeling, isn't it? When I go and get my nails done, I know the girls just jabber 20 to the dozen about their life. They all live in different places. They talk about their friends. They've got mobile phones, all the stuff that makes me think this is fine. So you're sort of looking for people who are reticent, they don't want to talk. There's maybe an element of fear around them. And of course, it's not just in the car washes and nail bars. That's what we're all led to believe. But so many of the places like the subcontracting of cleaners. So you might think you work in a really swanky office, but actually the person who gets the cleaners in, do your cleaners work for your company, or do they work for a cleaning company, or do they work for an agency that's brought a cleaning company? And there was a huge case in the Midlands last year, and it was absolutely horrific. It was a Polish gang who were recruiting men when they were coming out of prison, bringing them over to the UK, to the Midlands, with a promise of a new life, taking them to the banks to set up bank accounts in their name, acting as the translator, taking them to recruitment agencies, getting them on the books of recruitment agencies. So they were going out to do the work in factories or warehouses or whatever, but all the money that they were earning was going into fake bank accounts for the gangs. So they were earning nothing. The gang would maybe give them 50p or a pound. So it's knowing the supply chain of where you're working as well, or if you're in a hotel. It's not, I think if you're a good person, you just don't think that people can do this, but there are so many layers where slavery can slip into our life. As a consumer, I found it really difficult to think about supply chains, because I think, well, I'm a self-employed person on a budget. I can't afford high-end clothes. If I need to buy a new outfit and it's got to be a cheaper high street budget, that's kind of what I've got, and I didn't really want to open my eyes to that. What I did find interesting and really heartwarming about that was that actually a lot of the cheaper end companies, the high street brands, are aware of the cheapness of their product, and therefore the working conditions of where it's come from, and therefore doing from people that I've been speaking to who are working with them, doing great things to really combat slavery in their supply chain. So I think one of the brilliant bits of advice I was given was go on a company's modern slavery statement on their website. And if it's just like, oh yeah, slavery's bad, yeah, we don't like slavery, then it doesn't sound like they're doing much. But if it's a really forensic list of where they have found slavery in their supply chains, because if they haven't, that's weird. Even the most ethical companies that are working their hardest will find it, because the supply chains are more like nets. That was how it's explained to me. And it's really complex. And no, if someone says to you, we are slavery free, they are at best naive and maybe just haven't found it yet, or aren't looking. So really look at them on slavery statement on their website and see how thorough it seems. And don't always think because you're buying something expensive that it hasn't been touched by slavery, because in the fashion industry, garment factories, wherever they are in the world, yes, they could be making a £4 top for H&M or Primark or something, but they could also be making a £4,000 belt for Prada. There was a huge fire in a garment factory a few years ago, the Rana Plaza, and actually what everyone talked about Primark and I don't want to mention the names in case I misremember them, but there were definitely lower end high street shops that were made there, and everyone focused on their presence, whereas the high end ones like Prada, nobody really talked about it. I appreciate that's because in the news cycle, most of us are buying the sort of the high street brand and not the high end. But don't think just because something is super expensive, it hasn't been made in a factory with questionable working practices. And I think what would be great is the more that we shout up about it, the more that the people that we buy from will then maybe work together and say, sorry, we can't put up with that in our factories. We won't put up with this in our supply chains. And it's really massive. I didn't want to write that chapter because I was like, I look at my laptop or my phone and I just think, I don't know how many millions of things are in this phone. How am I supposed to be able to tell the provenance of every little bit of tech that's in my phone? So I just kind of shut my eyes to it. And I think for most of us, it's really difficult for us to have to make those really complex decisions when we don't know about people's supply chains. So I think they're the two things. Don't think that because something's expensive, it's safe. Accept that really it's going to be everywhere. But look on people's modern slavery statements and see how dedicated they are to stamping it out as best as they can.
Fantastic answer. Thank you. So next question, we'll do two more. So is there data on how the pandemic has affected human trafficking? And that's from Sturgios.
Great question. So data-wise, I don't have that. I think it's too early to have the actual data. What we do know is, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk the NRM, the most boring technical term ever, but the NRM. This in part of this year where the lockdown happened, the numbers of people going into the NRM dropped quite a lot, like noticeably a lot, and I think there's a concern there that victims aren't being found. For what reason that is, whether people are looking elsewhere, people aren't as focused on looking for it. We all kind of just went our way, didn't we? We all sort of scuttled back into our homes, and we've not been out and about. We've not been reporting it. We've not been spotting it. The other problem with the pandemic is the effect on survivors who are currently in safe houses, currently going through their treatment. A lot of the charities I've spoken to during this time, so post the book, but during this period, have apparently worked wonders in trying to take all those safety nets that they're used to, like therapy and classes and normality. They've tried to work with the new restrictions as best as possible. But with the best will in the world, people who have been enslaved are now being told to stay at home again. And it's been very triggering for a lot of them. Anecdotally, that's what I've been told. And thirdly, the ongoing problem is traffickers target vulnerable people, and whether it's this, we always know that after a natural disaster, after a war, people flee, and when people flee, they are targeted for people that are going to promise them a better life. And the flip side of that is, we're all going to, if there's an economic downturn, we're all going to be watching our pennies, and we're all going to want to go for the cheaper option. So it's this sort of toxic combination of more vulnerable people, us all wanting to save our pennies, and yeah, I think a lot of charities are very concerned about where the next 12 months will take us.
And our last question for the evening. Would you say that there are links between human trafficking or modern slavery and gender inequality? For example, are women significantly more trafficked than men? And if I can, I'd like to also just ask, where does race and immigration status come into this as well? So
That's a massive last question. Okay, so the gender question is really interesting. So we know that obviously women are trafficked more. Women and children, if you look at the statistics for global slavery, women and children are always the biggest victims. What is interesting is usually for sexual exploitation and child slavery. What is really interesting, though, is because, therefore, they are the most thought about victim, because they are the biggest victim, we then tend to not necessarily think about men as much. And also, it's important to note that men find it really difficult to talk about their experiences because, as we know, men don't really love to talk about emotions and open up as it is. So therefore, when you get a man who's been severely traumatized, specifically if they come from quite maybe patriarchal cultures, they will find it hugely difficult to talk about any kind of exploitation, any kind of abuse. So the gender issue is a really interesting one.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll do one more. Sorry, you're a fantastic speaker. There's one here that I'd really like to hear the answer to. It's from Maeve. What organizations and resources would you most recommend to support survivors of human trafficking and slavery?
Oh wow. I have to say, I've not come across a bad one yet. I think there's one in Sheffield that I think is fantastic just because it was started by a woman who is peerless in what she's done. I wouldn't say she's a one-man band because she wouldn't want me to, but she started up a charity called Snowdrop in Sheffield. And obviously she has a team around her, but she set up these safe houses after working in safe houses and refugees herself. And her background is, she was just so incredibly passionate about what she does. And rather than being a big charity, she sort of built this up herself from scratch. So Snowdrop in Sheffield is fantastic. There are some brilliant resources online in terms of how you can find out more. So I always think the Unseen website and the anti-slavery organisation website are really good, because they're really great at stats, and they can break stats down for you in a way that, I mean, let's be honest. You hear that over 40 million people around the world are in slavery. That kind of blows your mind. So the way that they break that down is really comprehensive. It means that you can, I wouldn't say comprehend it, because you can't, but they're really accessible in finding out more about the subject. The Modern Slavery Helpline is a really good resource because it tells you what to look for. There's an app which you can download and report. And when it does come to reporting, bear in mind, the onus isn't on you to be right. If you are wrong, it doesn't matter. No one's expecting you to be a police investigator. If you have a problem or an instinct or a suspicion and you report it, the experts then take over. So please don't think that you can't report something. Worst case scenario is they've done a visit and you were wrong. Best case scenario is you've given someone their freedom back. So they're the three sort of online resources that I'd use in terms of learning more about the issue. Hestia is a brilliant charity in London. They are a subcontractor of the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army, as I mentioned, they're the big umbrella company that have that initial contract with the government. A lot of the charities have a faith element as well. So there's the Medi Trust, who are I think Catholic, but they're definitely a faith organisation. So yeah, I mean, there are some people doing really good work in really difficult circumstances.
Fantastic. I think we've run over a little bit, so we do have to let people go. But I'd just like to thank you so much, Louise, for writing this book, for taking the time to speak to us about it, and for sharing your knowledge, and for making the stories of these people in your book available to us, because it's really just so valuable. I'd also like to thank everybody else for joining and for watching. You can buy the book. You can support Louise by buying the book. There's a link on Crowdcast, and you can go through the website as well. And yeah, just everybody, thank you very much. I hope you have a great evening. And also, I hope that I hope that little steps make the world a little better.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a little bit of the book that I just want to say, because I totally stole it from, it was an original speech read from Robert Kennedy that was then used in another speech by Caroline Hockety QC, who's in the book, and she gave me permission to quote her speech, and it's all about how we are ripples, and I really love that quote, and that's really stayed with me. So the very last paragraph of the book, that's what I'd like you to take away. But again, thank you for being here, and thank you for your comments. I'm going to have to go and read them all, because I might have a little bit of a cry if I do it now, but they're really lovely. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll end the broadcast now. Bye.
Bye.